So that's probably good.
All right. Let's give it another minute and then we'll get started. We've got a lot of people on the call.
Are we introducing ourselves?
Well, I have been muting people when it's been super loud, but I haven't muted everybody yet.
Okay.
I probably will mute people soon.
Okay.
If they're not already self-muted.
Okay. Anyway, this is Bill. So.
Hey, Bill. Awesome. Yeah, don't trip over things.
The 10 wombats might crash for the night. Making your day, try to do nothing at all. Until another time.
Why is he?
Somebody out there is getting feedback, and usually it's because you have you are on the phone and you have your computer audio on for some reason. That's usually the.
These are the culprit.
All right, so I'm going to go through and mute people. Know that you are muted, and because we want to make sure everybody can hear, but you can, if you're on your computer, you can go down to the bottom and unmute yourself. So right now, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, there's a bar, and on the left-hand bottom corner, there's a little mute button, and so you can unmute yourself that way. Or if you have a question, you can also type it into the chat, and I will try to pick those up as we go along. So, welcome. This is Katie Warren. I'm with the Washington State Association of Head Start and ECAP for the folks in other states. We are doing this in partnership with California and Idaho and Oregon too, or is it, I cannot remember who is part of this. And we are really happy that Alan Mattison, who is our a lawyer that works with the Heart Association, you know, we are all working on efforts to expand Head Start and early Head Start with state funding, and so we all have grants, and Alan has been a really helpful person for us in pursuing that goal. And we thought that it would be a good idea to have to really sort of drill down on what is allowable and what's not allowable, how we can do better at advocacy, given our challenges with you know, being government entities, being school districts, getting federal money and all of that. So I am going to pass it over to Alan to get started. You should be able to see his screen. And let's take it away.
Thanks so much, Katie. Appreciate it. And thank you all for joining this morning. And I wanted to encourage people, we've got the chat box open, ask questions in the chat box, and more importantly, just shout out questions as they come to you. I'm going to try to make this as interactive as we can for a webinar. As Katie mentioned, just unmute yourself if you want to talk. Keep it on mute for, you know, others' ease of listening if you can. But as Katie mentioned, you know, the goal here is to just figure out what Head Start programs can do. A lot of you already are up to speed on sort of what Head Start programs can do. Other people might say, you know, oh, I didn't know we could do that in terms of advocacy on public policy. So there may be things where, some bunch of the people on this call already know all of this. And I think my goal for folks who are on the call who already know everything is maybe to come up with a couple of new tactics or a couple new ways of thinking about things that we can implement, and also sharing what you know with the folks on the call who might not know as much or who might have some misconceptions about where the lines lie, about how much advocacy we can do as a Head Start program director, what our staff and what our teachers and parents can do. So what we're going to talk about is, what do we mean by advocacy? And how much can we do? How do we get our toes right up to the line so that we're doing as much as possible in our different roles, whether it's our role as a program director or getting teachers to feel comfortable doing advocacy. And then we're going to talk about the things that you're allowed to do that are easy. And the goal, I think, is to expand people's comfort zones. One of the concepts that my kids' summer camp director emphasizes is not getting outside of your comfort zone, but rather expanding people's comfort zones to understand what's allowed and what's maybe misconception in your mind, but it's totally okay under the law. So we'll go through this presentation. We had a question here about whether you'll get copies of the presentation. Absolutely. We'll send that out. So there's no need to feel like you've got to scramble and take copious notes or anything like that right now. The first thing I want to emphasize is that advocacy isn't lobbying. Sometimes people conflate the two, but advocacy under the dictionary definition is any process or act that supports a cause or proposal. It includes lobbying, meaning, communicating directly with legislators or getting the public to contact legislators about legislation. But advocacy is a hugely broad concept that encompasses so much more than just lobbying. And so by engaging in the full spectrum of advocacy activities, Head Start programs can really help to shape the entire ecosystem in which policy change occurs. So, we've got 3 pictures here of different advocacy activities that you can engage in. All of them are advocacy, but they're in different concepts of what's advocacy along that spectrum. And I'm curious to hear from different people on the call of examples of advocacy that your program may have conducted or that programs that you work with may have conducted that you thought were particularly impactful or effective. Are there folks on the call who wants to dive in first and give an example?
Hi, I'm Tanea and I'm from Washington. So our program, actually, we set up little tables at our back to school health fairs. And so I talked to different parents about how they could get involved more with our policy council, which is our parent group, and that sort of thing, and how they could attend even if they weren't the rep, and that their voice did matter. And I had postcards that they could fill out. I also did voter registration last summer. So just getting out in the community, I guess, is a huge thing. I do a lot of back to school drives, health fairs, community events.
Those are great. Those are really good examples. And that whole concept of just emphasizing to parents that their voice matters seems like the smallest thing you can do, but really it's a huge thing. That's really great. Thanks, Tanaya. We've got an example in the chat box of parents attending early learning advocacy at the state capitol. That's a really good way of getting folks to engage in advocacy. And is that early learning at the state capitol, MP Nicola, is that an example of, are they talking about legislation or just talking about issues that affect and impact Head Starts? You can just jump in. Good. So it might not, that's a key concept, which is just, advocacy doesn't have to necessarily involve legislation, as you're showing at the Early Learning Advocacy Day at the state capitol. It's an advocacy day and not a lobbying day. You're talking about the issues of Head Start without talking about specific legislation, which is useful. Another example anyone wants to share?
I know that in Washington, we do that every February. We have a big conference with parents from around the state, and we have a training, and basically we do advocacy in different breakout sessions, and then we go to the state capitol and allow the parents to share their stories with their elected officials. And so that's one thing that we do, and it's for ECAP or Head Start or Early Head Start, so it's a combined.
That's great, and that's terrific. Telling their stories, getting those stories in front of legislators is huge, more than, and we'll talk about that more as this webinar goes on, but telling stories is how we get change accomplished. David mentioned briefing people who are running for office, getting candidates to understand about Head Start and Early Head Start. It's a terrific example. And this example that you shared, David, about going to town halls to ask questions, that's great. We'll talk about that a little bit more, and I'll ask you to elevate those examples a little bit when we get to that. The key that we want to emphasize is that you don't have to chain yourself to the door of the Capitol building. You know, we're not asking people to do the maximal advocacy. We're asking them to take small steps to expand their comfort zone, because we don't win an advocacy campaign. We don't expand Head Start funding. We don't accomplish anything we want to do in one giant leap. It's all a series of small steps to get up that mountain. So the key is to make sure that programs recognize that they are knowledgeable, trusted messengers that can reach out to government officials and build relationships with people, so that the leaders come to rely on the Head Start program directors and teachers and parents, especially those parent councils, to seek out information, to hear those stories, and to have those stories shift the way that the legislators are thinking about issues. Now, one of the big barriers we face is not the Head Start Act, but it's people's misunderstanding of the Head Start Act. So under the Head Start Act and the HHS regulations, you're not allowed to use federal funds for lobbying. You're not allowed to use federal funds to influence federal legislation or state legislation. But what you're allowed to do is use other money for that. So you're allowed to use donations. If you're getting any money from corporations or individuals for lobbying, if you're doing getting foundation grants. Now, often foundation grants will be restricted, but they can help to advance legislative goals with those foundation grants. The key is to make sure that the staff are able to demonstrate that they had some other funding that they used. You know, for example, if you're doing a fundraising drive at your office, you're raising money for a new playground or something like that for a particular program. If you raise a little bit of extra money, that can pay for a few hours of a program director's time to go to the state capitol to lobby a legislator about legislation. So we're not required to keep specific time logs because of the small amount of time. You know, no one's spending 25% of their time in a month for lobbying. And that's what the regulations, that's what the rules require, is to keep a time log if you're spending a quarter of your time every month on lobbying. The regulations say if you're just spending a little bit of time every month on lobbying, just make sure that you're using other funds to do it. So, you know, some extra money that came in from the playground fundraising drive, that could pay for 2 hours of a program director's time to go lobby at the state capitol, for example. But when you're using federal funds, so the Head Start Act restricts your ability to lobby about legislation with legislators. But you can use that, you can use your Head Start funds, meaning the time you're paying for your salary. You can use that to communicate with legislators about anything else. You can use it to talk to them just about what Head Start does. You know, you can have them come to your program, see what your program's all about, and just learn what the problems are and challenges are that are facing parents and are facing your students. You know, so here's an example out of North Dakota where Senator Heitkamp was reading with some Head Start kids, and she posted about it on Twitter. So not only is she getting good publicity out of this, it's helping her to understand in her communication. You know, she said that she was talking with the faculty or the teachers. She was talking to them about, you know, how do you handle service demands? So she's learning from teachers, hey, we need more money for Head Start to hire more teachers. And that's great, and that helps to influence what she's going to be doing when she goes back to Washington. Now, the other important thing, so we're allowed to use our federal funds to talk to legislators about sort of the big pictures of policy and the stories of our facilities. We're also allowed to use federal funds to testify at hearings. So there's a specific exception here that allows you to testify at a hearing. And here's a Head Start parent testifying at a hearing, but the same thing works for Head Start program directors and teachers. That if there's a hearing about legislation, you can go on the clock and testify about the Head Start budget, for example. You could testify about any legislation that's coming up. You can testify about expanding early Head Start because of that exception. And you can do it on the clock. You can do it in your official role as a program director. And we want to make sure that people understand that in those situations about testifying on legislation, go ahead. Use that, use your, you don't need to try to find other funds. You don't need to take a vacation day to do it. We want people to get out and testify when they have an opportunity. Are there any questions about that, or are there examples that people have shared having done it themselves that they want to talk about? Or situations where you've encouraged parents' council members to go out and testify?
So this is Katie. That's actually our testifier. And we have testifiers all the time, directors, staff, and parents in our state government, although it's a lot less common on federal hearings. My question is that one of the things that we hear from programs is that they're hesitant if we have specific asks in our legislative materials. So unless it's really vague, like more funding, if we are actually pursuing specific legislation or bills, the question is sort of what's advocacy and what's lobbying, and I wonder if you're going to speak to some of those kinds of questions.
Yeah, we'll talk about that specifically. And you're talking about, so if you have advocacy materials, can they pass those along to parents from the program, for example, right?
Well, I mean, when we do a big advocacy event, and I'm sure this is true of Idaho and California too, we are giving them things to hand to their legislators. And to what extent can we be super specific on those apps?
We'll get into that in just a couple of slides.
Great. And Joel has a question. Let me see if I can find him on here. I can't actually. I don't know where he is. He'll text me the question and I'll ask later.
Okay, or you can post it in the, oh, Joel's on the phone at the car dealer, so.
Yeah, I can't even find him on the list, so.
All right. So another form of advocacy is getting people registered to vote. making sure people are engaged in elections. And the Head Start Act specifically allows programs to permit other organizations to come in and register voters at your program. Now, you can't use Head Start money from the federal government to conduct a voter registration drive yourself or do anything else related to candidates. I mean, we really need to be hands-off when it comes to any candidate activities. But we're allowed to bring in other nonprofit organizations that do nonpartisan voter reg to register all the parents at our facility, to make sure that all of the teachers are registered, for example. So encourage those other nonpartisan 501c3s to set up voter registration programs in your, in your facilities in advance of the primaries that are coming up and the general election next year. We had a question here from Terry about testifying at hearings. And it's a really good question. So the question is does it have to be invited testimony? Yeah, you need to be invited. So it's not just encouraging everybody to show up at an open hearing, but it's relatively easy to get invited to qualify for this exception. So for example, if you know about a hearing that's coming up, you could send an email to somebody on the committee, call somebody on the committee, and ask for an invitation to testify. All that really requires in this situation is that the committee member that you know reach out to you and say, yes, I'd like you to come and testify on this legislation. It doesn't have to be anything terribly formal. The regulations don't get into what that invitation needs to say, so there's not a lot of hoops to jump through. And because it's free, there's no cap on how many people a legislator may invite to testify. They're very open to sending that kind of an invitation. You just need to let them know, hey, in order for me to come down and testify on your bill, I need to get an invitation. Could you invite me to testify? And they'll go ahead and do that. I'm glad you raised that question, Terry. So this sort of raises the big picture question about what can you use Head Start money to do, federal funds, and what do you need to do without using federal funds? So when you're off the clock, you can do anything you want. You can volunteer for political candidates. Your free time is your free time. So when you're off the clock, do whatever you want. What you need to be careful about, so for example, if you're making emails or calls during the day that you're saying, well, I'm off the clock at lunchtime, just be sure that you're making up that time later on in the day, just as if you had to schedule your kid's pediatrician appointment, or if you had to run to the dentist, you'd make that time up later on in the day. Same thing with making a lobbying call to a legislator or sending an email to a legislator about legislation. If you're going to do that using, during the workday, just make sure you're making up that time at the end of the day, or that you're charging it to the corporate or individual donations that I mentioned earlier. Similarly, if you're doing it after work hours, you're free to do whatever you want. Just it's better to use your personal email account rather than your Head Start email account, so that there's no appearance that you're using any federal resources, any servers, for example, that are being paid for with federal Head Start funds. You're using your personal email to do that. And that's especially important when you're doing candidate activities. If you're doing anything related to voting candidates in the 2020 election, on your own time, using your personal email, not your Head Start email. You can also talk to staff about opportunities that they might have available. But there again, you need to be really careful that they're doing it on their own time as a true volunteer. We don't want them to be voluntold to do something, to make lobbying calls or what have you. If you're going to talk to staff about opportunities, make sure that they don't feel any coercion to do it. And then the last thing I wanted to mention in this section is that because you're working for Head Start as a Head Start employee, the Hatch Act, which is a federal law about not getting involved in politics, applies. And in this situation, for Head Start employees, really the only important part of it is that you can't run for a partisan political office. So you can't run for state legislature as a Democrat or a Republican, but if there's a nonpartisan election in your community for school board, for example, you're free to run for that under the Hatch Act. But if you're thinking about running for higher office, or if your teachers are, that's terrific, but just consult with a lawyer before you dive into it. So just to wrap up here with sort of the summary of advocating with federal funds, keep in mind that you can do what you want when you're off the clock. When you're on the clock, either use non-federal money, meaning corporate or individual donations to pay for your time, or advocate by talking about big picture policy issues. And this gets back to what we were talking about earlier about, Tanaya said, tell stories. Connect with leaders emotionally. Our job as Head Start program directors and teachers and parents is not to try to get into the weeds on data about how many, teacher staffing ratios, about budget funding for the entire state or program. Let the lobbyists in their fancy suits deal with those issues. But as a Head Start program director or teacher or parent, you can tell stories that really matter and have an impact. So here is Elizabeth Warren is off reading it to kids at a Head Start program in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And, she's got all these folks with suits who showed up to be in the pictures, a bunch of state officials and the local mayor. But that the people she's going to be listening to that are going to have an impact on her are the parents and teachers who are the front line, on the front lines with this program and understand how the program's working, what works, what doesn't work, what needs to change. So it's important to get folks, have her not just read for the cameras, but have her meet with the Parents Council so that she can hear those stories, because your parents' voices matter, and those voices will really have an impact. Oh, and one thing I wanted to mention in this context is, well, I'll hit it at this point here. When we set up these site visits, it works both ways. Often, a Head Start program director might be a little bit hesitant about inviting their senator or their representative to come visit a Head Start to read to their students. But you have to recognize that you're not just, it's a two-way street. They're getting a benefit out of it at least as much as you are. It's a good photo op for them. And they want to learn from you. They want to be connected to people in their community. So encourage your different programs to invite them. Create a photo op for them. And then have them meet with parents. Have them talk to parents one-on-one, especially your Parents Council. The Parents Council will probably be the most engaged and outgoing folks that want to talk to legislators. And as Tiana says, have parents who are a little bit more reticent or who can't come to that meeting, have a box available for people to share their stories on a note card that the senator or representative will collect and take with them. Encourage people to share those stories because they can't all do it at the time of a legislator's visit. And at the flip side, have the legislator come and do their visit right at the end of the day, just before pickup. I know it's a hectic time with tired kids. You might want to build snack time around that. But by having them there when the parents are going to be there, you're going to have more of an impact on those legislators. And as we were talking about, It's not lobbying. When a legislator says, what do you need? And you say, we need to have more resources so we can get kids off the waiting list. We need to fix these broken light bulbs. We need to repair our leaky pipes, and we need to get better air conditioning in our facility. Those are the types of things that are concrete and will really have an impact with legislators. They don't care that it's going to, they're not going to care when you say we need $1.6 billion added to this line item in the federal budget. Again, let the lobbyists and the suits say that. What's going to resonate is that leaky pipe or the broken air conditioning, so that they can have that story and sort of think about what it really means when we're asking to increase the Head Start budget. Any examples that people want to share about site visits, things that have worked particularly well, or experiences people have had inviting legislators to come visit? Diana, thank you for the suggestion about the note cards. I thought that was really insightful. When you do have people come visit, make sure to engage on social media to get the next hit out of it. It's not enough just to have that legislator in your program facility. Make sure the whole community knows that they were there. Tag the legislator so that the legislator knows, hey, when I come to Head Start, I get a nice boost out of this, and my constituents are going to find out that I'm doing this. So that'll make them want to keep coming back. And here's a great example from Idaho, where a state senator came by and, you took the picture, got it out on social media. That's terrific. Legislators also love to receive thank you notes and pictures from the kids. And one of the nice benefits of having your kids send a thank you note is often the legislator will frame it on their wall, which serves as a daily reminder, hey, I've got to vote for Head Start when it comes up, because remember that terrific visit I had with the Head Start kids out in Boise or wherever it might have been. So sending that thank you note can have a multiplier effect on how much impact your visit has on that legislator.
Twitter is a great way. Like, a lot of the lawmakers and elected officials are on Twitter. And so if you tweet it, then they'll repost your tweet, is how I've gotten the most likes. And then you just make sure that you're like actually on their official page, and there's like a blue check mark behind it. And that's how you can tell if their Twitter is official or not. A little hint. But
great point. Excellent. And then Katie mentions, of course, yes, absolutely, you need your photo releases for all of those kids who are going to be in the photos that you're posting on Twitter. Or photo releases so that if the legislator, if you're inviting the media to come cover your visit with the legislator, make sure you've got photo releases of those kids as well. Or if you're going to release photos, or if the legislator is going to take those photos and share them on Twitter. Absolutely. Whenever you're taking those pictures of kids, absolutely, you need releases. Thank you, Katie. So another, just advocacy tactic that might not even feel like an advocacy tactic, but it is, it's really effective, is just making sure to invite public officials to all of your events, because it reminds them that you exist. It reminds them of all that you're doing in the community, and they might not even realize, when you have a foster care prevention panel, first of all, they might not realize that's something Head Start does. And second of all, they could really learn if they show up at it. It gives them an opportunity to meet more people in the community and to show that they care. And many of them, not all public officials, but many of them do want to learn about new issues and about issues that they might not have encountered. Inviting them to a community open house, they're going to be in contact with a lot of their constituents. That's great for them. One example we got on the last webinar from Stanislaus County was invite them to present attendance awards. If you have an awards ceremony at the end of the year, invite whoever, a state representative, a U.S. senator, the local school board member. Invite them to give out attendance awards, because it'll make the kids feel so much more special and valued to be getting it from this important person from the community, getting this recognition. But it also helps those public officials to understand what it is that you do. And it's really useful. And then if there are any news stories, put them on your distribution list. That's something that your staff can do, is just to make sure that all of the public officials that they can think of are on your distribution list, so that when you get media coverage or whatever it is, that they find out about it, so that they see all the good stuff Head Start's doing. And then meet them wherever you can. So we mentioned earlier, a lobby day at the state capitol. Obviously, there's Federal Lobby Day in Washington, D.C., and those are really important. And one of the questions that arises there is about staff, whether, how do teachers or program staff interact with parents at those events? What if they don't have any money that they raised? One situation is you've raised a bunch of money or a little bit of money from your playground drive. That could pay for 3 hours of your program director's time to go to a lobby day and lobby about state legislation. Or what if you just have the program directors come and staff to help facilitate the logistics, but they're not talking about legislation? Generally, that's going to be okay. If they're not talking about legislation, but they're sort of facilitating the logistics of getting your parents around the state capitol building, that's more or less okay. Another way to deal with it, of course, is setting up that advocacy day, as we talked about earlier, where you're just talking about big picture policy, but not addressing specific numbers for the budget. In the example that Katie raised, of if you have materials that are very specific about legislation, some program directors are going to feel more comfortable distributing that ask directly to the parents, including it in a communication from the program to the parents to say, hey, our state is going to be voting on this legislation. It's important that, it's an important legislation for our Head Start programs. We wanted to make sure you knew about it. Other program directors might not feel comfortable with that. And so, again, it's a situation of trying to engage the Head Start directors to the extent that they feel comfortable with it, in that sense of having expanding your comfort zone and having people take small steps toward advocacy. But in addition to going to the State House, one thing that can really make an impact on legislators is visiting them at their district office. And so when they're at the State House and the legislature's in session, two things happen. First of all, it's a pain in the rear to try to get a whole bunch of parents to get to the state capitol for lobby day. It's important, but you all know how difficult it is to get parents to take that much time off of work, to facilitate the buses and all that, getting them to lobby day. Instead, if you set up, and the second thing that happens when the legislature's in session and you have a lobby day, you get 15 minutes of that legislator's time, and then you're out of there, because that legislator is being hit by every advocacy group in the state trying to lobby on the budget. What can be more important and more impactful sometimes is having a meeting in their district office, either when the legislator is out of session or Monday or Friday, depending on how the legislature works. If you meet them in their district office, you can have more impact because you're not rushed out in 15 minutes. You can sit with them for 30 or 45 minutes and really talk about stories that impact your program. And it helps to develop that relationship, that long-term relationship with the legislator, a lot more effectively in a lot of cases. And then, as David mentioned, find out when their town halls are. find out where they're going to be having a district meeting and show up so that you can talk about Head Start, raise questions at their town hall about where they stand on Head Start. And it's going to have an echo chamber effect. You know, you can ask your question and ask everyone in the audience to raise their hand if they've been impacted by Head Start, if they've had someone in their community or in their family rather who's been a Head Start student. And that can help to emphasize to the legislator that it's an important program. And then engage your alumni. Now, your alumni of your program, they might not be Shaq or Darren Walker or Sylvia Burwell, but there are probably engaged alumni in your community who are now business people, who are other local civic leaders, that people might not realize is a Head Start alumnus. And it's great to engage those alumni because they might have personal connections and personal relationships with those legislators.
I had one senator come and talk to us, and he said that even if they are supportive of Head Start, they still like to hear from us to know that what they're doing and what they're pushing for still matters to the community that they represent. And a lot of the times he said that they forget because we are supportive, so we get kind of, you know, forgotten about in a way because we aren't reassured by our community that that's still something that they want unless we go and talk to them.
Well, and that's exactly right. That's, you know, talk about the successes of Head Start and the challenges, not
Go to something.
you know, not in terms of specific budget numbers again, but in terms of fixing the air conditioning or the leaky pipe, or talk about how so-and-so is, you know, as an alumnus has accomplished so much, or we had 16 kids from our program who graduated this year and went on to college. And it was great hearing from them. They came back and they talked to, you know, we had these high school graduates who came back and talked to the younger kids and they inspired them. Get those stories out to legislators, because one of the challenges for Head Start, frankly, is it's been so successful that it's entrenched in communities in a way that legislators might not notice it the way that they noticed it initially as it was making its successes and achievements in the first years or decade. Now that Head Start is such an integral part of the community, I think legislators take it for granted. So we need to keep successes and need to keep emphasizing that the challenges are not gone. Now, so any other, before we get into sort of roles for each party, other tactics that people want to suggest to colleagues for engaging in advocacy? Examples that you've seen that have worked well, or other ways that people have built relationships with legislators?
Just meeting with them constantly, even if it is their staff person, you're still making that connection. And sometimes a staff person has more time to talk to you, so that connection can get a bigger foundation, I guess, or gain a better foundation. I've worked really hard with my local congresswoman over the last year and a half, I guess, to build that relationship. And when I went to see her in DC, she was shaking everyone's hands, and then she bear hugged me. I was a little shocked, but it's that connection piece where she's seen my face enough, and you know, that common ground. We both grew up in small towns, and I guess just that constant I guess, or meeting every chance you can.
Yeah, it's all about relationships. Getting legislators and public officials to listen to you is because you've developed that relationship and you've invested that time over the years. And there's no one who's too small. You know, I've shown examples in this, in the slides of various U.S. senators, but all of those U.S. senators started off as a school board member or some other small local official. So it isn't that they just leap to being a senator. There's someone in the community who's a local community leader, and those are the people that you want to build relationships over the long term.
That's only two, it looks like. No. Oh, yeah.
And someone's got, if you could mute, if you're having a background conversation, please mute the line. So what can people do? What can we have people do to engage? First of all, center directors have such an important role here. First, sharing information with staff and parents, making sure that the staff and the parents know about different opportunities to engage, either engage directly on legislation, putting out communications from the program to the parents about there's a lobby day going on or an advocacy day going on at the state capitol, or we're doing this town hall meeting, or there's going to be an open house where State Senator Murphy is going to drop by for a site visit. We hope everyone will join us. So initiating those site visits, communicating with parents about those site visits, and just figuring out all the different opportunities to reach out to government officials and to engage the teachers in that activity as well, where it's appropriate, where you've got funding. And then I want to clarify here, in my previous webinar on this, we mentioned lobbying or fundraising if possible, fundraising money for lobbying. And I'm not saying that you need to go out and try to raise money for a lobbyist. This is the situation where, as I mentioned on the fundraiser as an example, raising money for a playground. If you just raise a little bit of extra money to pay for an hour or a couple hours of the center director's time, that center director can then go off to lobby at the state capitol about legislation and not have to take a half day of a vacation day. There's no reason they should have to burn through some vacation time. They just need to make sure that their budget has a little padding from non-federal Head Start money to pay for their lobbying activity. Number two, teachers. Get them to open up and talk to legislators. They may feel like it's not their role to talk to legislators or to complain about what's not working or this or that. Make sure that they feel supported in talking to legislators. And to the extent that the teachers are developing outreach lists, or any program staff have an outreach list where they develop and share information, whether that's on social media or emailing out media stories that have been written about the center, make sure that you've got legislators on that list. And then last of all, for the parents and for the policy council, they're such an important integral part of your advocacy. Encourage them to call legislators, encourage them to tag legislators in posts that talk about what it's like to be a parent and how important Head Start is to them. One of the challenges for Head Start in particular, but I do a lot of work with all sorts of different public health groups, and that age basically from 0 to 5 is the most under-resourced time in people's lives in terms of federal funding. But also, and this is the reason why there's so little federal funding from 0 to 5, is that that's when it's hardest to be a parent. Any parent can tell you that from birth to age 5, you don't have a free minute in your day, especially if you've got, working parents. There's no extra time in their day to reach out to public officials, to go on lobby day visits. And because of that, we've set up a situation where legislators aren't hearing about the needs of people aged 0 to 5. And because they're not hearing about those needs from parents, they're not getting legislation passed. And so, as stretched for time as your parents' policy council members are, encourage them that it's so important for them to get involved and share their stories, tell those stories to legislators so that the kids from age 0 to 5 are getting heard, and the needs of parents in that age group are also getting heard. Now, there's often questions come up about, hey, how can the policy committee itself engage in lobbying? And policy councils are paid for with federal Head Start funds in almost all cases. So you can't use the official policy council meetings for lobbying. But often what will happen will be council members will set up a volunteer committee where they'll informally connect and create an advocacy committee where they'll engage with legislators. And the more you can do that, the better. Everyone, as Katie mentioned, also your governing board as well. Figuring out what connections that the people on the governing board might have to legislators. You know, if you really want to get involved and take that fourth or fifth step beyond just initiating site visits, reaching out, setting up the meetings at their offices, a really ambitious center director or state director might do some power mapping to figure out, okay, who are on the different governing boards and what connections do those people have to legislators? Who are our most influential alumni? How do we activate those alumni and get them to reach out to the different legislators that they might know? Sending out a survey to governing board members, to policy council members, to alumni, especially those alumni. Sending them a survey to find out who they know and what organizations they're connected with that might have some overlap with those legislators. It all circles back to figuring out ways to create that personal connection with legislators, to build that relationship and tell our stories so that we can influence the way that legislators are thinking. And so I've got three key takeaways here. The first of all is that people shouldn't be shy about lobbying. If they've got private donations or as center directors do it on their free time, you can do as much lobbying as you want. And then if you're just using government funds from Head Start, you can still do policy advocacy about talking about that leaky pipe, that leaky faucet, or the need for more teachers, the need for an upgrade on the facility to clear the waiting list so that we can serve as many students as possible. Emphasize to every parent that their voice matters. That was one of the first things that I think, as Tayana said at the beginning, was their voice matters and they might not realize it. The parents in your program might undervalue their own voice and think that they're not as important as other people who are getting listened to by legislators. But their voice matters absolutely 100%. And so do all of your teachers and program directors. And then just circle back to make sure that the program directors recognize that everything that they do matters. If they're only going to take a small step, great. Better to take a small step than not to take a step at all. Only through taking all of those sequential small steps do we get any kind of policy change to happen. So don't ever let anyone think that a step is too small to bother taking, or that it's inconsequential, because all of them add up to policy change, to affecting the change that we need. So why don't we take a pause there and ask what questions people have at this, things I might have said that were unclear or surprising to people, or other lingering questions. Katie or anyone else, other things that you think that colleagues would benefit from hearing about?
I don't know. Do we have a, I think that this question of lobbying versus advocacy is always kind of a fraught one, and trying to figure out what amount of our time. I mean, everybody can lobby, right? Or at least, and parents definitely can lobby, but there's a real limit on the amount of time. Advocacy is much more broad. Do we have a written description of those things that we can share along with the PowerPoint so that people can really see the difference of what that, what kind of activities belong in one category and what kind of activities belong in the other?
Sure, we can do that. I mean, really the distinction is whether you're talking about specific legislation or not. And that if you're talking about specific legislation with legislators, then you can't be using federal Head Start funds. And so the question is, what specific legislation? And by that, go ahead.
So I guess my question there is, I think it's easy when you're talking about a policy bill. If I go into an office and I say, Head Start is awesome, this is my experience, that's clearly just advocacy. If I say Head Start is awesome, this is my experience, please give us more money, is that then lobbying?
No. So that budget question, that's a really good question. And that budget context is where it comes up the most often, I'd say. So it's obvious that on one end, it's not lobbying to say, Head Start is awesome, we need your support. That's not lobbying. And Head Start is awesome, pass Senate Bill 27 that's going to protect us forever. That's clearly lobbying. And the budget stuff falls in the middle. So if you're saying a specific budget amount, Senator Smith has proposed $1.6 million for new teachers in early Head Start. We want you to support Senator Smith's $1.6 million proposal. That's going to be lobbying because you're talking about a specific dollar amount that should be in the budget. And in this case, you're talking about Senator Smith's specific proposal. If you just say, we need more money for early Head Start so that we can clear off the waiting list, that's not lobbying because you're not giving a specific dollar amount. So the legislator doesn't know exactly what to vote on is the way that you'd approach it with, in terms of, are you talking about specific legislation? No, there could be a lot of different proposals that would increase funding for early Head Start, and you're not talking about any specific proposal. You're just saying, we need more funding for early Head Start. So generally, as you're talking about it, if you're just talking about the concept of needing more teachers, needing more money, that's not going to be viewed as lobbying. It's only when you give a specific bill or a specific dollar amount to include in that budget that would make it lobbying. I can write that up and include that in when I circulate the PowerPoint.
Yep, that'd be great.
I'll jot a note down here. Other questions? Oop, another comment here. Let's see what it is. Yeah, so, and it's just non-lobbying. If nobody, if there's no dollar amount mentioned, or you're not talking about a specific bill, it's just talking generally about policy then, and so that would not be considered lobbying. So if other folks have questions, I mean, we're up at the hour, and I know that it takes a lot of energy to listen to a PowerPoint, so I appreciate your putting in the time to participate so well.
Ellen?
Yes.
Now, a parent, they can ask for specific, to support a specific bill or a specific dollar amount. That would not, okay.
So if parents are going to be spending their own time doing this, their own money rather, a parent is asking a legislator, they can ask the legislator for whatever they want to ask for, and they can do it with very specific dollar amounts and budget amounts.
Okay, thank you.
I'm glad you asked that. If other questions come up, send them up to your state leads, and they'll pass them along to me, or you could send them directly to me, and we'll make sure that we get all the information distributed out to everyone who is on the webinar.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. And thank you to Alan and to Bill over in Idaho and Chris down in California. Really appreciate being able to come together to do this. And
Dawn as well.
Recording, so this will also be available as soon as I figure out how to do it. It'll be available online for people to access who couldn't make it to the meeting. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the week.
It was great
All
information.
right, bye-bye.